All right, now we're moving on to the concept here, very important about it, is how is God present? So here I'm going to introduce something that'll help us sort of for the rest of our essential Christian doctrine studies, because now that we know what kind of a being God is, he has certain attributes. Well, how is God present? When God creates us, how are we present? And so we want to think about how substances relate to each other and how they present themselves one to another. And ultimately, I think we'll unlock a lot of biblical ideas here by understanding this. So roughly page 19 of the Theology Proper Part 2 handout, what I've got here is the types of presence listed. And so give you an example here. In studying this, here's some of the issues that we can study better and know more deeply if we understand this. For example, the dual natures of Christ. Now, really, especially now, I'm recording this the day before Good Friday, and one of the things that has perplexed people in thinking about this is, for example, we think about presence or awareness. We think about, okay, Christ dies on a cross. Well, we answer the question, how he dies as a God-man. But then between death and resurrection, people ask, well, where was Christ between death and resurrection? So, and actually, if we understand the three distinct substances that constitute a God-man, it's actually fairly easy to understand. Where is Christ with respect to his divine nature or divine substance? Well, he's where he's always been, everywhere. Okay, he's omnipresent. And as we'll see in a minute, well, where was his body? Well, bodies have what we call a local or circumscriptive presence because you can draw a circle around them. You can say it's there. You can locate it. It has spatial extension. Well, you can locate his body being in a particular physical location. But then when we start thinking about the concept of a soul, souls aren't physical things. So for that, we think about it being an illocal and definitive presence where it's created, it's mutable, it exists as a substance with causal powers, it's not omnipresent, it's not locally present. So the same way, when we die and are with Christ in the afterlife, we still exist and our soul is present somehow. So I'll go to those three basic definitions and then we'll flesh out a little bit more how this can be helpful. But, like, as I mentioned, how does a human soul and body work? But also, last one here to think about, a lot of people think about demon possession. And this is really the issue. We think about demon possession because in the scriptures, Gadarene demoniac accounts, there were literally hundreds to maybe even 1,000 demons in this one man. So the question is how can that many spirits be present in one place at one time? And the answer is, well, if they don't have a local presence where they have spatial extension, then the issue is, well, probably all of them can be present because they don't have any spatial extension. They exist and are present in a different kind of way. So that's the idea there. And of course, by the way, that gets to the old issue, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? And the answer is, if they have an illocal presence, all of them. Okay, because they don't have spatial extension. So on that, first definition of physical stuff has a local or circumscriptive presence. And this simply means it's called a local presence in the sense of it has a location. It's the mode of presence of finite physical things. Okay, so we say that's a local presence. We also call it or describe it as having a circumscriptive presence because things that have physicality are spatially extended. So you can circumscribe it, as I mentioned earlier. You can draw a circle around it and say, there it is, I've located it. Okay, like when you get out your finder on your phone, your GPS locator, it's like, aha, there it is. It's in a location. That's where we get the idea of a local presence. It has spatial extension in the physical world because it's a physical thing. But then when we get to non-physical things, okay, like the divine nature itself, God says of himself, God is spirit, and we that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And we get to the very nature of a soul. Souls are not physical things. Okay, again, they are. We think about a soul versus a spirit. We'll get to more of that when we get to anthropology. But I'm using soul and spirit here roughly synonymous, even though there's some differences. It's a non-physical substance in which our rational faculties are grounded. So in this case, we have to move beyond a local or circumscriptive presence and now talk about, okay, it's not local, so let's talk about it as a spiritual or virtual presence. You can't really draw a circle around somebody's soul to give it a location. So, but yet we know that human souls are not omnipresent. So how do we start defining this carefully for our theological thoughts? Well, a spiritual and virtual presence would be this. Spiritual means it's non-physical. Virtual means is that we measure its presence by its effects. Okay? I can't draw a line about it, but what I can do is see what effects it produces. So this is why for a human soul, we would say that a human soul would have what's called an illocal and definitive presence. So the first, when we say it's illocal, it's a negation of locality. Well, whatever it is, it's not physical. You can't circumscribe it. So that's the first thing we say is it's in a local presence. It's a created, finite, spiritual substance. Okay, but how is it present? Well, it's present illocally. It's not present in the way physical things are. But then we would turn around and say it's virtually or definitively present. And so, for example, an angel as a created spirit and a human being as a created spirit, what we would have here now is say, well, here's the question. How do you know your soul is present? Okay? Well, it's not because you can draw a circle around it. It's because of this, because the body without the spirit is dead. The fact that your soul is psychosomatically united with your body and producing a living body, we can say that your soul is now present in your body. Well, guess what? Your soul isn't over there gaining knowledge. Your soul is not animating another body. So in that sense, it has a limited or it's definitive. It's defined or limited by its limited powers of operation. Okay? That's an illocal or definitive presence. So that's why it's significant when we think about this. When we die and you, as a Christian, you go to heaven, guess what? You're still going to have an illocal and definitive presence. You're not going to be omnipresent. You're still going to think one thought at a time like you do now as a limited being. But when we think about that type of presence, it's interesting because now you get into the concepts of, say, spiritual warfare. Illocal definitive presence would be something like this. I mentioned the Gerasene demoniac account a little bit earlier. And here, it's important that, yes, maybe there could be 1,000 demons possessing one man, but it's interesting that those demons couldn't be in multiple places at one time. They could all be in one place at one time, but not in multiple places at the same time. So when Jesus cast out the demons after an interesting dialogue where, the demons asked Christ if he's come to torment them before the day, and then he asked them if they can go into a herd of pigs that are in a field across the way. So it's interesting that Christ cast them out, but they had to somehow stop manifesting their presence in that one place, talking to Christ, and somehow traveled, in quotes, however spirits travel in the spiritual world, had to go across a field, enter a herd of pigs, and now those individual demons seem to be possessing a whole herd or multiple pigs. So there, which, okay, I'm going to say it, yes, created the first batch of deviled ham. Okay, never mind. Okay, so you can write that one down. It's supposed to be funny. So all that to say is that, see, that's how illocal and definitive presence works. So now let's move on to the God's present. In the past, when I mentioned the conceptions of divine attributes, I compared omnipresence and repletive presence. And so now God, as a being of pure spirit, not a physical being, he is present in every part of the created world as an immense spiritual being, okay? And he fills the universe and is not contained by it. Now here's some stuff to really meditate on, okay? First, the fact that God is present in every place as a being and as a substance in every place in the created universe, that he is somehow present, with a quote here, in everybody's soul and everybody's body. Otherwise, he's not omnipresent. Okay? So that means what? Physical stuff, created limited spiritual stuff, and God can exist in the same place at the same time, just not in the same way. Which, by the way, there's some sense where your soul is in your body. Again, your soul with an illocal presence, your body with a local presence. But guess what? Physical and spiritual stuff can be in the same place at the same time, but not in the same way. Okay? So now when we start thinking about this, we've got God's omnipresence or reflective presence, the illocal and definitive presence of souls and angels, and then local presence. Let's apply this in a couple of areas, okay? For example, think about how life and death work as concepts. See, we're told in Genesis 2:7 that God formed man from the dust of the ground, breathed into him the spirit of life, and that's when we became a living being. When you have your soul or spirit that is present in your body, and this is important, and is manifesting its presence in psychosomatic union with the body, you have biological life. James 2 says, just as the body without the spirit is dead, faith without works is dead. Yes, the body without the spirit is dead. When your spirit ceases to manifest a presence in union, in that psychosomatic union with your body, now you have biological death. Okay? So that's how, when we start thinking about the presence and manifestation and union of two kinds of substances, it produces a certain kind of effect, like life or death. So biological life and death, already explained it. But now we move on a little bit. So what's the concept of demon possession? Well, it's the presence of a spirit which has an illocal and definitive presence as a spiritual substance, in now somehow controlling or in union with somebody's human nature, arguably controlling the person's body, not necessarily their soul. So at least some demons, not necessarily all of them, but maybe some demons have learned at some point in their demonic existence, have learned that point of psychosomatic unity among human beings, and given the invitation and the presence and all of this that goes on, they've learned how to control a human body. And as we see in the Gadarene demoniac accounts, they're using that person's body to speak through it and everything else. More on that in demonology, but that's an example, again, of an illocal presence that is in union with and manifests using somebody's human body, okay? And so that's, but what's interesting though too is, again, that you have a demon who is in the same place at the same time as another spirit who also has an illocal presence. So your human spirit and that demon now, illocal presence, can be in the same place at the same time, not in the same way, in your body. So with that, we move to the next concept. And for example, thinking about the work of angels, and now we get into a very important distinction of being present but not manifest. Okay? According to biblical angelology, which there's a lot to be said here, but look, God has his helpers. He sends them to do all sorts of things around us. And there's some passages in the scripture, like with Elisha in 2 Kings 6, where the Aramean army is surrounding the city, and somehow Elisha can see the chariots of fire or angels all around him. They're present. Elisha can somehow perceive them, but the servant can't. And then Elisha prays, and God opens the servant's eyes, and now he can perceive what was not manifest, okay? So whether that means seeing into the spiritual world or anything, that's for another discussion. But the point is that there are things that exist, are substances that are not physical, that may be present, but they're not manifesting their presence, okay? And that's significant now because we move to the next concept. Think about what spiritual life and spiritual death mean. See, we already talked about God's omnipresence, where God is present everywhere simultaneously, but here's the key. God does not manifest his presence with everyone and everywhere, because when he does as a personal spirit, it would be manifesting it usually in relation to someone. So what we see in the Garden of Eden, and now we get to the concept of spiritual life, is that the God, who has a repletive presence, is manifesting that repletive presence in a personal relationship with Adam and Eve prior to the fall. What's spiritual death? God ceases to manifest that repletive presence. Now he's hidden and is not in a functional active union with Adam and Eve. So a cessation of divine fellowship and activity and a loss of that manifestation of divine presence and relation is what we call spiritual death. Okay? It's a separation that results in an inactivity of divine fellowship. So what's spiritual life? See, now we think about life. Spiritual life is pretty easy to understand. The wages of sin is death. So yes, God withdraws his relational presence from us and the manifestation of it. But through again, by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, to the glory of God alone, because of what Christ has done for us, when that is imputed to our account and we are regenerate, we're not guilty, we're forensically justified, we're adopted as children of God. See, now, what does it mean to have new life in Christ? It means that because now God can't have fellowship with unrepentant sinners because of his justice, more on that later, but now, where God was always omnipresent, God is now manifesting that personal repletive presence in an active relationship with the believer. So God was always present, but not manifesting it. And here's a couple of examples that might help trying to understand it, because we don't want to conceive of God as being some sort of Swiss cheese spiritual entity where somehow wherever sin is, God isn't. Okay? No, God is as an infinite, immense being. As a substance, he's a substance that exists everywhere, but doesn't manifest it everywhere. Here's an example that might help you. I can say probably in your room and in this room right now, we know there are lots of radio waves and signals in the room, all sorts going on. But here's the point, is that they're present but not manifest. So how is it that they would manifest or not manifest? Well, it's pretty simple. If you have a radio that has a proper tuner and receiver, if you tune in to the proper wave frequency, now you'll be able to pick up the broadcast. Okay? Now, but again, if you're on the wrong frequency, you're not going to pick up the broadcast. So this is why if you get a radio and it's tuned properly, now that signal will manifest the information that it's carrying because you're tuned into the right frequency. It was always there, but you weren't tuned into it. And you couldn't perceive it because it was non-manifest. So now think about this on how that works with sin, life, and death, and righteousness. Okay? Getting saved, okay, well, let's start with Adam and Eve in the garden. What happened in the garden when Adam and Eve sinned? In effect, with their sin, what they did was they turned the tuner of their heart, okay, to the wrong channel. So God broadcasts on one frequency, and that's the holiness, okay? God is holy, and he says, "Be holy, for I am holy." So we could say God broadcasts on 77.7 FM, right? K-God. And if you're going to get the broadcast, what do you have to do? Your receiver, see, yourself in the image of God, have to be tuned to holiness. But see, Adam and Eve turned their natures to 66.6 FM. You don't want to go there, okay? So now so God stopped manifesting his holy presence in their life. What happens when we get saved? Well, God changes us. Imputed righteousness, we go down the list. Penal substitution, imputed alien righteousness. We're not guilty now. We're justified. We're adopted as children of God. But what's interesting is God actually now changes our dial too, where he changes our hearts. He gives us a new heart, changes our dial from 66.6 FM back to 77.7 FM. okay, and makes us now qualified to hear the broadcast again. So at that point, what happens at that point? You have the baptism of the Holy Spirit, or the manifestation of God's presence in your life in that personal relationship. So this is an understanding of how hiddenness and manifestation of types of presence of the different types of substances and beings can help us in our theological understanding. So anyway, next time we'll start looking at the concept of the doctrine of the Trinity and a few other conceptions. But to end this, again, this will help you answer a whole lot of questions, like where was Christ between death and resurrection? Is God present in hell? Things like that. Well, yeah, God's present in hell, but he doesn't manifest his presence. God is present in unbelievers, but he doesn't manifest his presence. So this is how you have a coherent view of Christian theology and God and creation, where now it makes sense how all these things can be together and at the same time not conflict. Anyway, see you next time.